everybody, wherever you are, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. Welcome to the webinar. I know we've got a couple of people that are back on a regular basis, and I really appreciate your support. Thank you. So, the topic we're going to look at today is tools for effective feedback and creating a culture of performance improvement. I think all of us know in this broadcast that people are not getting enough feedback, and feedback can be positive or negative, and really, in terms of any sort of feedback, people are telling us over and over again in surveys that they simply aren't getting the uh, the amount or even quality of feedback that they think they deserve. So it's not surprising that this was a very popular webinar. So let's get underway. I want to share with you, I guess I'll just talk a little bit about what I'm going to cover, and if you've got any questions or comments, please type them in as soon as you think about them over on the right hand side, because if you do that, then if I can see that there's a question there, I can stop the presentation during the next hour and just respond to that while it's fresh in your mind. So that's the best way to deal with that. So just let us know, because obviously I'm going to be covering a lot of material in the next hour. So we're going to look at some sobering statistics to start with, and I think some of these statistics won't surprise you, but these are statistics to demonstrate that we really need to be giving more feedback in the workplace, that it's critically important. So I want to set the scene by talking a little bit about that, as you could probably understand. I then want to talk about some how-tos. So some of the things that are critically important in terms of giving feedback, and some of the things that shouldn't be done. And I'm going to cover, say, half a dozen, maybe a few more tips and hints on that, because I think we can never get enough of this. We often forget, or in the heat of the moment, we forget about doing something. So I do want to cover those, and then I want to talk about 3 models that you might find useful, because these are the tools that you can use to frame your feedback around. So essentially that's what we're covering in the short hour that we're together. Okay, talking about sobering statistics, have a look at these figures. I think these are very interesting. So these are interesting statistics. So up the top there in the top bar, you've got receiving strength-based feedback. Now, when, and these are surveys that have been conducted with employees, when strength-based feedback is given, that is, feedback based on the particular team member's capabilities, innate talents and their strengths, when that feedback happens, unsurprisingly, we have a high level of engagement. So employees feel quite engaged. So obviously that's a preferred position. Interestingly, in the second graph underneath, we've got receiving critical feedback. So this is feedback that's not positive. It's something around somebody not doing something correctly, or a standard wasn't met, or perhaps a job wasn't done the way it needed to be done following a particular process or procedure. So when that's done, we have a situation where engagement drops off to a certain extent, and you can understand that, but it doesn't drop off dramatically. But what's really interesting in this result is the bottom bar, which says if somebody doesn't receive any feedback at all, absolutely none, then engagement drops off significantly. So in other words, what it's basically saying is that we need to be giving feedback, positive and negative, at every opportunity in order to engage our particular team members. That's essentially what it means. So no feedback is not necessarily an option if we're talking about actually engaging people. So it's interesting that that should be the case. If I could tell you a quick story, I remember talking to a young employee who had just started in an organisation. She'd only been there 9 months, and typically I asked her how was she settling in, and she said, "I don't know." I said, "How could you not know?" And she said, "Well, I've received no feedback." And I said to her, would you like me to approach your manager and ask that person to give you feedback, seeing as you've been here that long? And she said, oh, that'd be fantastic. So I approached this manager, and I'll never forget it. And I remember walking into his office and mentioning to him that so-and-so had been there 9 months and she'd received no feedback. Is it possible that he could give her the time to give her some feedback about how she's settling in? And he looked at me very seriously over his half-moon glasses and said, I couldn't do that. And I thought to myself, well, there must be something going on here. Are they having an affair, or, you know, is there some strange conflict of interest that I know nothing about? I was really quite unsure about what to say next, but I said to him, do you mind if I ask why you can't give her feedback? And he said to me, point blank, if I give her feedback, I've got to give everybody in my team feedback, to be fair. And of course I was rendered speechless. So unfortunately, we might laugh at that, but that is the attitude that's out there in the world of work. Lots of people think that feedback, it's probably better to give no feedback than to give negative feedback. Well, according to these data, that's not necessarily the case. So let's have a look at some other statistics around feedback. Roughly 3 to 1 employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. So that's interesting. So people are not necessarily after positive feedback, they're after any feedback, and more particularly constructive feedback. In other words, not criticism. So there is a difference between criticism and constructive feedback, of course. Secondly, an interesting comment here that the secret of having employees listen to your feedback is whether or not they respect you. Respect is the critically important key. So respect is earned, and it's incredibly hard, as we all know, to get, and it requires authenticity. So really, at the end of the day, and I say this time and time again to managers, that you are in the business of being respected rather than liked, and it's a very important lesson I think we should learn. Final bit of feedback there is that you could have the exact same thing said to 2 different people with 2 completely different effects. So this is not some formula that if we basically give people feedback in a certain way using a certain set of words, we're going to get exactly the same response from 2 separate people. Not the case at all. So individuals will react to feedback in different ways, and I guess we've got to respect that, and that's important. Having said that, there are a few principles that are critically important when we give feedback. Let's have a look at some of those. Just finally, before we move on to looking at some of those, let's have a look at some performance review statistics, which are quite interesting. 30% of performance reviews end up decreasing employee performance. That sounds pretty frightening to me. There's certainly no evidence that I've seen anywhere that performance feedback actually increases performance. 58% of executives believe their current program doesn't result in performance or engagement. That's a bit of a worry. 70% overwhelmingly of companies are now reconsidering their performance strategy. We're probably aware of that. A lot of those companies have gone public. 2 out of 3 employees with highest performance scores aren't actually the highest performers. In other words, we aren't terribly fair when we give people ratings, which is always a concern. 6% of companies surveyed think performance reviews are worth the time. Only 6%, which is obviously meaning 94% don't think they're worth it. 2% of HR executives say yearly evaluations are useful. So these are the people that actually administer them. I know some of you are involved in this broadcast today. 80% of workers are dissatisfied with the performance review, and 3% improvements in performance all managers believe will be generated in the process, only 3%.
So they're significant results, and I just wanted to paint that picture before we started to look at some of the things that should happen in relation to performance reviews. So I might just pause there. If you've got any questions, type them in where you've got the little box there that says questions. Type them in, or if you've got any comments or observations, please share, because I will share them with the rest of the group. Okay, so while you're considering that, let's move on. So I think one of the fundamental things that a lot of managers don't do is manage their expectations of the people that they lead. And this is critically important, and it's based on a number of critically important questions. So the very fundamental question that a manager has got to ask is, what are my expectations as a leader? This is critically important. So if a manager can't, indicate or understand themselves what their expectations are, that's a major concern. So a manager's really just got to think to themselves, what's the bottom line of expectation that I have for everything that's said, done and thought about in my working area? The second question that they've got to ask themselves once they've established what their expectations are is, have I communicated these expectations to my team? Now, a lot of managers I talk to would say, yes, I have. But of course, this is a persistent and consistent message. This is something that's done every day, in every way, in all sorts of different forums, both formal and informal. So the question then is, perhaps, have I done it regularly enough? Because the next question is the critically important one. Do my team understand my expectations? So do they actually understand them? Not do they accept them, do they understand them? And, I guess you could ask people and say, do you understand them? I'd say yes, but they don't really. But at the end of the day, if the team members that a manager leads don't understand the expectations that their boss has, that's not a particularly good start. Do the team members then accept those expectations? Do they think they're unreasonably high? Do they think they're too low? What do they think about those expectations? That's critically important, because if somebody doesn't accept them, they're likely to do everything they can not to meet them, and that becomes critically important. Somebody's just asked the question here, I'm interested to know where the data came from for the first couple of slides. Deloitte's data from, in fact, Deloitte's, I can get you the specific reference for that, Desley, so that's where they came from. Next question is, are my team members omitted to meet those expectations? In other words, what I mean by that, are they held back from meeting those? In other words, are the timelines unreasonable? Are the instructions too broad? Are the information that people need not readily accessible? So people have obviously got to be able to perform with the right tools. So a manager's job, of course, is to be able to break down those barriers and enable people to be able to meet your expectations. So you can see it's quite a complex set of questions, isn't it, around managing expectations. Do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? So that's where the feedback comes in. So do they know? Have you given them regular feedback that explains to people how they're travelling in terms of those expectations that you've set? So that's probably critically important, but you can understand that if you get to that question, do my team members know how they're performing against the expectations? If people aren't aware of them, they don't accept them, and so forth, in other words, all those other questions haven't been answered, then giving feedback is not necessarily going to be effective. So it's not just all about giving feedback, it's about a process of letting people know exactly what you expect of them, getting their agreement, and then giving them feedback based on that. So there's a whole lot of important things in relation to that. The next question is, am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? So this might be coaching, it might be encouragement, it might be providing the necessary links to various stakeholders internally and externally. It might be giving people or delegating to them the authority that they need to complete the task and so forth. So that becomes a critically important factor in performance as well. So you can see that there, I'll just go back to that slide. So you can see that there are a lot of important questions. So if those questions are fundamental, because if we don't get them right, then it's impossible for us to be having robust feedback mechanisms that really improve performance. So let's look at some of the principles, notwithstanding the fact that, as I said earlier, people will accept feedback in different ways. Here are some basic principles that are quite important in terms of feedback, and I'm sure many of you would agree with this, although sometimes in practice it's not quite as easy to do. It's not quite as easy to do. So timing is critically important. The sooner somebody gives feedback after an event, critical issue or situation, the better, both positive and negative, because the sooner a leader does that, the sooner the employee understands the importance of it. In other words, if it's done straight after a particular event, the message is very clear that this is important, so much so that I've stopped doing what I'm doing in order to give you this feedback. Absolutely critical. I've heard managers say during performance reviews, for example, remember 6 months ago you did project X. I've got to say I wasn't terribly happy with how you did that, particularly some of the details around the planning aspect of the program. Now, what the employee or team member's thinking at that point is that if this was really critically important, you would have given me that feedback right there after the event instead of 6 months after. So timing is critically important, and of course in practice that's not always that easy, because you might be, or whoever, a leader might be right in the middle of doing something, and all of a sudden they've got to stop and conduct some feedback because of this, and it's not that easy. So obviously it has to become a priority. In other words, the longer you leave it, the less effective the feedback actually is, and that's for positive feedback as well. So for example, can you imagine if you said to someone, I didn't get a chance to talk to you, but 6 weeks ago you gave a great presentation at the weekly meeting, and I just wanted to congratulate you on that. Now that was 6 weeks ago, and the person's probably sitting there appreciating the fact that they got some feedback, but thinking to themselves, well, it couldn't have been all that important, because if it was, my boss would have given it to me right there at the time. So timing is critically important in terms of feedback. The feedback also should be very specific, and I've had cases where people talk in very broad terms, such as, you really need to work on your people skills, or your report writing is very poor, or you don't communicate very well, or you are not really a team player. So that sort of feedback is very generalized. It can be taken the wrong way because it's not specific, and it probably isn't going to be very effective. So it's much better to be very specific, and that's why I think feedback is best done around a critical incident. So if you select a critical incident, you can talk specifically about that critical incident. So for example, if somebody had spoken over the top of 3 people in a team meeting, and the team leader came out of the room and basically pulled that person aside and said, listen, on 3 occasions there you interrupted your colleagues, before they had a chance to finish what they had to say, and they probably felt frustrated about that. And so that's much more effective, isn't it, than to say that you don't listen to people enough, which is obviously generalised and likely to fall on deaf ears. So being very specific is important, and what that means basically is thinking very carefully about how you're going to broach a particular subject before you broach it, of course. So let's have a look at some of this feedback that I mentioned that should be specific. Here's some examples. So overall, good job on the presentation at the morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Now that's too general. It's probably better than nothing, but the person's sitting there thinking, well, I'm not sure what you mean by that. They might, if they feel assertive enough, ask, but they shouldn't have to ask. Wouldn't it be better to say, you know, as it says there, this is so vague, you know, it doesn't work. So let's have a look at perhaps what you might say. So you might say something like, great job on the presentation. I really liked how you use statistics to back up your key points. I've got one small comment, however. Maybe for next time, you should invite more comment from the group so that you can get them more involved in your presentation. See the difference? See the effect that that has? It's a much more constructive, much more specific. So feedback, timely and specific, and of course we need to be giving it regularly, and this is one of the reasons that I'm dead set against the whole notion of the performance review, because it happens once a year or twice a year. And what happens is that a lot of managers save up all of their feedback for those occasions because they're convenient and it gives them something to talk about, and they'll raise all sorts of feedback, normally negative, during those meetings, instead of doing this on a regular, consistent, frequent process. So feedback is regular. It's happening every single day. One of the most practical things that I say to managers is that every day I want you to be conscious of giving 3 bits of feedback every single day. Write it down somewhere, you know, make a note to yourself and give feedback 3 times every single day, and it's amazing what a difference that will make. And I'm not just talking about negative feedback either. So being frequent is regular, ongoing, never-ending, and people will often say, I don't have time for this, or maybe the person really should know. Well, perhaps they should, but often they don't, and it's the leader's job to actually recommend that. Now, one of the things about feedback is that the assumption is, of course, that feedback is all about, you know, using clever phrases and putting things in ways that will be meaningful to the particular employee. It is in part, but I actually think the secret of feedback is actually asking questions. In other words, it's all about asking the employee or the, you know, the team member to consider the, you know, ask them for their feedback. So, for example, after a particular project, maybe this team member has only done this for the first time. What about then saying to that person, how did you think you went? So start off asking them for their own feedback. You might be then a bit more specific and say, what did you think you did well? What did you think you didn't do so well? And what will you do the next time you have to do this that is different from the way you did it this time? All right, there's a nice little framework, and it gets the person to start to evaluate and assess their own self. And as the leader, you can then jump in and say, yeah, you're right, or I agree with you, or no, I'd suggest something else. And it makes it a lot easier for you then to give your feedback once they have given their feedback. And you only have to do that a couple of times, and people get very clear about that. I think one of the reasons that this is so difficult is that most people that move to a leadership position have got there through superior technical skills. And people who learn technical skills have actually learnt to answer questions. So we go to university or we do a trade so that when somebody asks us a question, we can actually answer that question. That's essentially what a technical know-how is for. So all of a sudden we're put into this leadership role, and it's just so hard to break that habit. And to actually to say to somebody, why did you say that, or what did you mean, or who did you talk to, or when did it take place, or how did you get to this position, is difficult. It's not natural. But at the end of the day, the more we can get the team member to be thinking about their own performance, the better. That's essentially the secret of giving good feedback, is actually getting the person on the receiving end to think about their own performance and be able to critique it. That really means that we're doing well. And the only way you can really do that, if you think about it, is by asking a bunch of questions. That becomes the critically important thing to do. All right. Now, I think all feedback should be done privately. And this is not so easy to do because many of us work in open office environments. So often giving a private feedback is not that easy. It means sometimes we have to book a room, which can be a pain, or perhaps even go outside, and we notice that everybody knows that we're going outside. So that makes it a little bit intrusive. But somehow we've got to find the opportunity to do this in privacy because, and it's very important, it's respectful. It's showing respect to the other person. And so during a meeting, for example, is not the time to be giving people feedback. After the meeting in private is definitely the time to be giving feedback. So I think people often say to me, praise in public and criticize in private. I don't buy into that. I think there are many people who are quite introvert, quite quiet and shy, who would prefer to have positive feedback done in privacy. They get embarrassed in front of their colleagues and so forth. So I'm not necessarily bought on the idea that we should be publicly praising people. I kind of think that we should try and do that in private for most occasions. All right. Now, another really important principle in all of this is that we should be finding critical incidents. And these critical incidents can be positive or negative. They happen every day. So during today, there will be literally hundreds of critical incidents that are occurring around you. Phone calls, people doing things, emails being sent, all sorts of things, meetings being held. There are lots and lots of fertile ground for critical incidents. So there's no shortage of opportunities to give feedback. What we've got to do, or what leaders have got to do, is attune themselves to that opportunity and look for those opportunities. So critical incidents become vitally important because they are real. They're in the moment if the feedback's done immediately. We can quarantine the feedback around the incident. So in other words, it forces us to be more specific so that we're not generalizing. And so therefore it's more likely that the individual will listen to the feedback, which is really, really important. All right, so keep those questions coming in because I've covered a bit of territory there, and very shortly I'll be moving on to a couple of frameworks that you might like to use to help you with feedback. So yeah, just type them in when you're ready. Now another principle that's really important is, and one that's very important actually, is to try to focus on the future. The only reason that anybody's giving feedback is to try to make some change happen in the future. In other words, what's happened in the past has happened. There's absolutely nothing that you can do to change it. That's rational thinking. All you can do, all any leader can do, is to provide the necessary feedback to ensure that that incident is done differently or dealt with in a different way in the future. And this is really important because often feedback sessions can descend into criticism and people making excuses about not having this and having that. The only reason that you talk about the past is essentially to learn from it, but not to wallow around in it. So, you know, I think it's fine for a leader to say, look, I don't really want to go there. I just want to talk about what we're going to do moving forward from this point. You know, that's the way they need to manage and handle those sort of situations. Otherwise, what happens is we get into blame games and criticism and all sorts of strange things, and we don't want to go there. So it's all about the future. So it really is about how we can prevent that from happening again, how we can do more of that again in the future, or how we can modify what happened in the future. So I have a little saying that I love: learn from the past, plan for the future, and live in the present. It's a good learning point for all of us. So it's just about learning from the past. So the critical incident is a learning point in the past. It's not an opportunity for blame, whatever becomes critically important. All right, so here's some other guidelines before we launch into the models that are critically important. One guideline is that when you pull someone aside, it's critically important to get straight to the point. This is not time for chit-chat. We're actually interested in just getting straight to it, because if you've pulled that person away from their work in private, as you should, they're often wondering, what is this all about? And the longer you leave it, the more the tension rises. So get straight to the point. This is not a conversation in the lunchroom. This is and that doesn't have to be a hostile conversation, but it just needs to be a conversation where you get straight to the point. Critically important. At the outset, explain the purpose of the meeting. So you might say something along the lines, the reason that I've asked you to come in to talk to me today is that I wanted to talk about the meeting that we had a couple of hours ago and my impressions of that. All right, so I've kind of painted the scene about what it is that I want to talk about. Again, the person has a right to know what it is that you intend to cover in that meeting. Another important point is once you've explained once you've given your feedback, a very good principle is to keep quiet and allow the other person to communicate their view about the feedback. Apart from anything else, it gives you a break and a chance to think about what you might say next. But you want to get some buy-in. The best feedback is two-way. In other words, the other person is quite prepared to comment on the feedback, and that's really important. Otherwise, it's just one way. It becomes a monologue, not a dialogue. So you might say at the end of giving your feedback is, I'm interested to hear what your views are about that. What do you think? And then allow that person to comment. And if they disagree with you, it's better to know that right there and then, isn't it, than not to find out that they've completely ignored the feedback that you've given them. So that becomes critically important. And while they're talking, they may well say some very provocative things. They may well say some inaccurate things. It's really important to bite your tongue until it bleeds. In other words, don't interrupt. Allow the person to say what they want to say. And then at the end of their comment, you can easily go back and say to them, look, there's just a couple of things that you mentioned there that I'd like to address. All right, and then you address them there. Why do we want to do that? Well, it's respectful. And secondly, I'm sure you don't want them interrupting you when you're talking, and you've certainly got the high moral ground when you say to the other person, look, I gave you an opportunity, I'd appreciate the same opportunity. So that becomes critically important. Okay, avoid confrontation. This is not an opportunity for an argument. And remember, it takes two to have an argument. So frankly, if the other person is argumentative about the feedback, it's really important to say to the other person, look, I refuse to argue with you about this. Or if it's not quite as critically important, you might just say, let's agree to disagree on that point. Just don't argue. It's not a confrontation. It's not meant to be a confrontation, and it shouldn't be a confrontation. And you control, or the leader controls, whether or not it becomes a confrontation. Secondly, it's really important to focus on performance. What I mean by that is it's not about the person personally, it's about what they're doing or not doing. So it's about performance. And the sooner you lose sight of that is the sooner this will likely go off the rails. As I said before, focus on the future. It's all about what we're going to do differently or continue to do in the future. And I think it's very important to try to balance up any sort of feedback with strengths as well as weaknesses. So talk about what they're good at as well as what they're perhaps struggling with. So in other words, it should be a balanced conversation. Easier said than done, I realise, but at the very least you could say to somebody, look, I've got every confidence that you can do this, and that's why I'm talking to you, because that's the truth, isn't it? I mean, if you didn't think that they could change or improve, what would be your point of giving that feedback? Okay, and finally, seek out the causes. Use questioning skills. Ask why. Why did you say that? What did you mean by that? Who did you talk to? When did it take place? And be prepared to do that. And if you feel a bit uncomfortable sounding like a detective, it's a good idea to say to people, do you mind if I ask you a few questions so that I can get to the bottom of this? And normally people will say yes, in which case then you can launch in without feeling as if you are playing detective. So that's a good methodology to use. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the third element of what we're going to discuss today, and I'm going to share with you a couple of models that I think you might find useful. Now, many of you would be familiar with the 5 Conversations framework, which is a framework that I put together that can either be a substitute for the performance review, or it can be an enabler to improve performance. But the framework is around 5 conversations, so they're basically 5 10 to 15 minute conversations with each direct report once a month over 5 months. And as you can see on the screen, you've got climate review, the first conversation, which is very much around job satisfaction, morale, and communication. The second conversation is around strengths and talents. So what we do there is we talk about what people are good at, and we start thinking about ways and means of being able to use people's innate talents in the work that they do or in future roles in the organisation. It's a much more constructive place to start than to start talking about weaknesses. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't talk about weaknesses. We should. In fact, that's what the third conversation's all about. Opportunities for growth, which is really about getting the person to come to that conversation with a couple of areas that they feel they can improve on, which are growth areas, and for you to assist them in that regard. The fourth conversation is around learning and development. There's a good chance that if you're talking about people's strengths, job, climate, and you're talking about the climate, strengths and opportunities for growth, it's highly likely that there'll be some opportunities that come up which are learning opportunities. And I don't necessarily mean sending people off to courses. It may well be you showing someone how to do something. or explaining something a bit clearer, or giving people some coaching. So learning and development can be very informal, but at least if we have those two conversations in month 2 and 3, it sets it up nicely for an L&D conversation in month 4. And the final conversation could be around innovation and continuous improvement. So if you think about it, month 4 is about how do you improve yourself. Month 5 is around how do we improve our work area. So these are ways and means of making our organisation more efficient and effective. And if you don't have a conversation around that, it's highly likely that nothing will come up. And managers get very disheartened about that. But if managers don't think, uh, if team members don't think that managers are interested in their ideas, why in heaven's name would they bother to put them forward? So why not have a conversation about it on a regular basis is a good way. So I'm expecting in conversation 5 that people will come to that meeting with some ideas and to generate some thoughts and processes that might be implemented. And of course, not all ideas can be implemented. And I think this is important, that just because people discuss an idea with you doesn't mean that you feel obliged or the leader has an obligation to implement it. Not at all. I mean, in a lot of cases, it might be completely unrealistic. And in fact, it's important for leaders to understand that people get that. People understand that not every idea that's being floated inside an organisation will get a run. They know that. But they also expect that some ideas will, and the good ones I'm talking about, will be utilised to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the organisation. All right, so that's the 5 conversations framework. If you'd like some more information about that, please send me an email and I can certainly explain that a bit further to you. But that's one framework that can be quite powerful, and one tool, if you like. Another tool that I wrote about in one of my books with Aubrey Warren, Conversations at Work, Promoting a Culture of Conversation in a Changing Workplace, we talked about 5 other developmental conversations that should be happening on a regular basis. These conversations, of course, are about feedback, essentially. So let's have a look at them. So, and these aren't necessarily in any order, but one of the conversations that people should be having on a regular basis is coaching. And coaching is a conversation. It should be a two-way process. And coaching doesn't necessarily mean talking about technical issues. It could be talking about how to manage different situations. So good leaders have regular coaching conversations. Another particular conversation, which is less formal than the coaching conversation, is the mentoring conversation. And these are more about career, these are more about giving people advice and so forth. And these conversations can be enormously powerful. We've got a lot of people in this broadcast today, and I am sure the law of averages would be that many of you have had significant, life-changing, career-enhancing conversations with a mentor at some stage in your career. So many of you would know the power of the mentoring conversation, but yet we don't have those on a regular basis in the workplace. But that's another feedback opportunity. Another feedback opportunity, of course, is delegation. That should be a conversation. It's not just about barking out instructions or orders. It's actually working with the other person to work out a strategy or a plan to tackle a project. That is something that might be developmental. So delegations is a conversation, and of course, again, people don't do this very much because, well, there's a lot of reasons. One is that they like doing it themselves. Another reason is that they don't have faith in other people that they will do it to the same standard that they expect. Another possibility is that they just couldn't be bothered with the time, the perception of time. So we all know that there are a lot of leaders who really could be delegating a lot more than they currently do, without a doubt. Another conversation that's critically important, I think, is the visioning conversation. And the visioning conversation is one that is sadly missing in our world of work. This is the conversation where we talk about the why of work. This is the conversation that Seneca and others talk talking about why we are doing things, not how we're doing things. People need to understand the context of why they're doing something, and this is extremely valuable feedback. Give you a very simple example. Somebody's in a production area and the production manager comes over to them and says to them at the end of the shift, could you please sweep the floor? Now, this person's never been put in that position to have to sweep the floor before. Now, if that manager continues and says, the reason that I'm asking you is that we've got a customer coming in, a new customer coming in this evening, and she wants to look over the production area. And this person has the potential of spending a significant amount in our business on product. And I want to do everything that I can to create a really good impression. That's why I'm asking you to sweep the floor. Now, I'm sure that person's not going to go away jumping up and down with delight, but at least they've got some context around why you're asking them to do that. So the visioning conversation is really important. Again, I think there are two reasons managers don't do this. One is that they make the wrong assumption that their direct reports actually understand the context, and they often don't. And two, it just soaks up a bit of extra time. So why not just ask people to do things without bothering to give them any kind of context? And that is a mistake, of course. So that's giving feedback on the context. Another conversation that's sadly lacking in the workplace, and this is the fifth of the 5 more developmental conversations, is the encouraging conversation. I wonder whether managers see themselves in that role of being the encourager. I think the good ones do. However, I suspect that a lot of managers don't see themselves in that role, and I think that's because to get to a position of management, you have to have a little bit of self-motivation, and you then make the assumption, of course, that everyone that you lead has the same get up and go that you have, and then you make the wrong assumption that they don't really need an encouraging conversation. They just need to suck it up and get on with it. Big mistake. People do need to be encouraged. We all doubt ourselves more than we lead on, and often we don't walk around with a sign on us saying, I feel inadequate about doing X or Y, but that's how we feel. And a good idea for a manager is saying to them, I've got every confidence that you can do this. You might be feeling a little bit apprehensive about it, but I'm going to walk you through and help you with this. But it is part of your development. I really want to help you get through this. So I wouldn't be giving it to you if I didn't think that you could do it. Now, what's that taken? 20 seconds can make a big difference. And that's feedback. That's feedback about the person's capability to do the job. So encouraging conversations are critically important. Now, another model that I love is the GROW model, G-R-O-W, and bear with me if some of you understand what this is, but I think it's one of the best tools that you could possibly use as a leader in terms of cultivating a culture of feedback. G stands for G stands for goal. So when this is the perfect framework to use when somebody comes in and wants to get an answer from you. We've all had people come to us when we think they should know the answer to this. And then, of course, what you do is you give them the answer, and get the monkey off your back, so to speak. But how about starting with the question, like, just before you go on any further, in other words, they want to tell you all the warts and all detail about, the problem and the challenges and everything else. Stop them mid-sentence and say, before you go any further, what are you trying to aim to achieve here? That's a really powerful question, because if the person can't articulate what the end result is, now obviously for something very simple, that's not a smart question, but something that's a little bit complicated, you can actually ask them that question. And if they can't articulate what the end result looks like, then that's a problem. So then they say, I want this to happen. You say, great. Then you go into R and you say, which is reality, and say, okay, tell me specifically what the barriers are that are getting in the way. So what I've actually done is I've got rid of all the other stuff around, the peripheral stuff around, he said this, she said that, blah, blah, blah. I just want to know what the barriers are that are preventing that person from doing what it is that they said they needed to do. So they've told me, so I've reduced the time on that. Then I go to O for options, and then I say to them, so what are the options open to you? And of course, it's not surprising then when people say, well, that's why I'm coming to you. Hold the line on that and say, yeah, but if I wasn't here, what would your options be? So it's really important to get them to articulate what they perceive to be the options. And you'll notice it's plural. So basically that means that you want more than a one word, more than one answer. You want a couple of possibilities. And normally, most things, there are several possibilities. And you get them to articulate what they are. Now, this is the hardest part, because you, being the technical expert, may well want to jump in and give them the answer. Well, that's killed it, stone dead. And then the W is the wrap-up or way forward. So you might ask a question like, okay, what do you need to do now? What's the first thing you need to do to get this moving? And, at that stage, normally they will be able to give you an answer, and you have reduced a conversation which may last for 45 minutes to 10 minutes. That person has actually walked out of your work area or your office empowered or enabled to complete the task, and you can be assured that they know what they're doing because you've listened to them. So there's a lot of really positive things that come out of that. So I would strongly recommend Try and Grow, and what I suggest is that you actually write the word GROW up on your notice board or wherever you can see it in line of sight. So when somebody does interrupt you, you can revert straight to Grow. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end. If you've got any questions, please type them in, because we've still got a few minutes. I just have a couple of quick advertisements or announcements I'd like to make, some things that you might be interested in. I've started this year a Lunch and Learn series, which is essentially an online series, and it basically means that people can, over a sandwich at their desk, as you may be doing now, or wherever you are listening to this, can actually listen to a broadcast once a month on a topic. So you can see over on the right-hand side there's some topics that are ideal for anyone in a leadership role. And so it means that that person can take and absorb a lot of information in an hour, and they're given homework to do. So I actually work with them and say, here's what you need to do. As a result, then off they go and they do that and come back the next month for the next topic. It's very cost effective and very effective, and I'm pretty excited about expanding it for 2017. This is priced at $176 a person, and if you have 5 or more people from an organisation, I'd give you a discount. Great value for money. So you might like to think about that. If you're interested, send me an email and I'm more than happy to send you a flyer, and it's very easy to register. So that's one thing you might like to consider for 2017 if you're looking at cutting budgets in your workplace for L&D but don't want to cut the quality. I also have a one-day workshop that I run which is called Conversations at Work, and this is a one-day workshop which covers many of the principles that we've gone through today, and it's designed to give people more confidence and capability to have more meaningful conversations in the workplace. So you might like to consider that. Again, send me an email if you would like to know more about that. And finally, there's two books there that you might be interested in, and I'm more than happy, being Christmas, to give you a 20% discount plus postage on either of those two books. So if you send me an email, I'm more than happy to send you a key, or a code, I think they call it, which you can put into my website and get your 20% discount. So take advantage of that while the going's good. So come back to me in the next 24 hours, but because you've given your time up today, I'm more than happy to offer you that concession. All right, so questions. I'm just having a look over here to see what people have got. One question here is, how do you control people when they get upset in conversations when you give them negative feedback? This is a very typical question. Thank you for that question. Look, I think the most important thing is to keep cool and calm yourself, and not to get flustered. As I said earlier, it's important to let the person know that you're not going to argue with them, and that's a decision that you make. But not arguing with them means that you're not necessarily backing down either. You'll find that often that's the reason that we avoid having conversations and feedback sessions, because we're really worried about how the other person will receive the feedback. Let them worry about how they receive the feedback. You just worry about giving the feedback. And if you give the feedback in the right way, there's a good chance that they'll accept it in the right way. And if they don't, then it's not your fault. And frankly, it's not a problem either, because they still know what the feedback is. I often find a very good technique that I haven't actually covered during this broadcast is to actually say to people, here's the feedback. I don't want you to give me, I don't want you to respond to it right now, but I want you to go away and think about it. Would you be prepared to do that? So I finish with a question. Now that allows that person to go away and absorb the feedback, and then you can follow up and say, did you get a chance to think about the feedback that I gave you on Tuesday? Did you have any comment that you wanted to make about that? And that's a very powerful way of disengaging some of the negativity, because by the time they walk away, they've sort of sifted through it and thought it through, and sometimes they're a little bit more reasonable the second time round than they might be the first time. So that's a great question. So that might help. Okay, that looks like all we've got at this stage, and we're pretty much on time. So can I say thank you very much. Wish you all a Merry Christmas, if that's applicable to you. Happy holidays, if you're going on holidays. Have a safe holiday. And don't forget, next year I'm going to have a brand new webinar series, 12 webinars. I'm working on them right now, and I'll have them posted on my website at some point. So please keep an eye out for that and my website, and you'll receive a copy of this presentation, both in slide format, and also you'll get a recording of it, and I'll send that out to you hopefully today. So you should receive that today and give you a chance to absorb some of the messages. So thank you very much, and I wish you all the very best. Thank